Adrian, yes, not just the Supreme Court, but so many lower court positions have been filled by the Republican Party. It's been a major achievement. Let's discuss this and the implications of all of this. Josh Blackman joins us. He's a constitutional law professor at South Texas College of Law in Houston. Jeff Hauser is a lawyer and executive director of the Revolving Door Project at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. And back with us once again is journalist and host of The Bottom Line, Steve Clemens. And it was a long-held goal, Josh Blackman, off the Republican Party. The theory seemed to be, look, demographics are against the Republican Party. You have to capture the judicial branch and the lower courts, and so that you could sort of, as a bulwark against the regulatory state, but also demographics. Interestingly, tonight, perhaps we're getting a more complex picture of the demographics, in which way they will swing, whether to Republicans or Democrats. But was that sort of the plan, and have the Republicans pretty much achieved that?
I think the Republicans have spent the last 30 years on the judiciary, a focus, because so many Supreme Court nominations from the Republican Party has not panned out. Justice John Paul Stevens, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, Justice Anthony Kennedy, Justice David Souter. So many of the Republican nominees sort of went towards the middle, even went towards the left. So there's been this strong focus on vetting judges in ways that hasn't been done before. I think President Trump has seen gains. He had Justice Neil Gorsuch, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, and now, much to the surprise of everyone, a third pick in the last few months of the election with Justice Amy Coney Barrett. This has been not expected, but a serious victory for the Trump administration. But
then, Jeff Hauser, what impact does this have, not just, I suppose, the Supreme Court necessarily, but also the lower courts? That's where we're seeing all these new judges. And it was interesting, the professor there talked about the vetting process. Some of them had barely any experience in the judiciary, but they seemed to be being picked out for their ideological line, in their 30s, a few years as a lawyer, perhaps, or not even, and then, now they're suddenly they're judges. What sort of impact is that going to have now?
It's going to have a lot of impact, especially if Democrats do not take the Senate tonight. I suspect Biden is still going to squeak out a presidential victory, but the Senate looks a lot more difficult for Democrats, which means that adding additional judgeships across the country is impossible. And so it means that contingency and fortuity has benefited right-wingers in this country. Jimmy Carter spent 4 years as president and made 0 Supreme Court nominations. The consequence of that was the Bush v. Gore decision in 2000, which gave the presidency to the Republicans in an election in which they did not win the popular vote. And that eventually, after 9/11, led to 2 Supreme Court nominations and a very narrow election in which they lost the popular vote in 2016. And now they're going to, they've gained it further on the Supreme Court, and they have been assiduous in finding every opportunity on the lower courts as well. So they've been as dedicated as Professor Blackman suggested, but they've also been the beneficiaries of tremendous luck.
And Steve Clemens, it always seems like the Democrats just didn't take this as seriously as they should have when they had the presidency in both houses of Congress. They're just completely outplayed by the Republicans on such an important issue.
I think it's really right. I like the comment that our guest just said, that it was tremendous luck, but it was incredible, tremendous focus. That if you watch the Republican National Convention, they talked about Amy Coney Barrett, the Supreme Court seats, constantly throughout the convention. You watch the Democratic National Convention, it hardly came up as a topic. It has, for whatever reason, not been a full and central focus, even though gay rights had been a key decision out of the courts. There are issues about the fragility of women's abortion rights and women's rights to choose. There's a whole range of rights fragility out there that could very well end up in the Supreme Court. And with the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, all of that has come to the fore. But when you go out and you poll Democrats versus Republicans, the court comes up very low.
But Professor Blackman, it's interesting that Steve mentioned abortion, Roe v. Wade, the key case there. There was just an exit poll on Fox News, no less, which said that a majority of voters that they polled said Roe v. Wade should be left as it is. 71%, not even a small majority, 71% told Fox News in their exit poll that Roe v. Wade should not be touched. How far can a Supreme Court, as the one we now have, go if public opinion is completely against, for example, overturning the right of a woman to choose?
I think there's no appetite to overrule Roe entirely, but Roe is not the only decision that's on the books. There are other decisions that go beyond Roe and put different types of restrictions in abortion. I think what's likely to happen is the court peels back some of the abortion cases. So, for example, perhaps limits can be posed earlier in the pregnancy. Perhaps different types of late-term abortion procedures can be banned. Perhaps there are more hurdles in terms of what the doctors have to go through with licensing. So I think there are different decisions the courts can render that make it harder to get an abortion, although the procedure still exists in large part for the first several months of the pregnancy.
So it is cumulative, death by 1,000 cuts kind of thing, which of course will need then organising. It's interesting. Jeff Hauser, Howard Zinn, the great progressive historian, used to always say, look, Roe v. Wade wasn't even passed because of a sympathetic bench. It was because of public organisation, pushing from below, making the public pressure something that the Supreme Court couldn't ignore. I mean, is there an element of that? And that's perhaps what needs to be mobilised if progressives want to save some of these rights.
Well, I think Supreme Court justices were less fixed in their ideologies back in the early 1970s. 5 of the justices who were in the majority in Roe v. Wade were appointed by Republican presidents. Democrats have not had a majority of appointees on the Supreme Court in my lifetime and for a few years before it. So, I mean, I think, yes, there definitely was pressure that was applied to justices, and there were a combination of social movements and great lawyering got to a result like Roe v. Wade. But it's not as clear to me that the current Supreme Court, the 6-member majority, is as responsive to those forces as their predecessors were a couple of generations ago, and that's worrisome to me.
Steve Clements, what impact is all this going to have on the election results as we see them? I mean, clearly, Trump said pretty clearly, we're going to send the lawyers in.
Well, it's a backstop. I mean, you already see them litigating in Nevada and Pennsylvania and places all around the country. They've got a very, very astute and on-the-mark legal team challenging it at the edges. But I think the big issue is if you get, another case, as we've talked all evening about, like in Florida with Gore versus Bush, having that Supreme Court and having that stacked deck there is a nice backstop.
But Professor Blackman, haven't we come a long way from the year 2000 and Gore v. Bush? Isn't everyone a little bit more aware of what could happen, of the minutiae of these legal fights? Can the Republicans, for example, as the Democrats fear, disenfranchise thousands of votes without there being an outcry?
I think the biggest difference between 2000 and 2020 is when the litigation occurred. In 2000, the litigation occurred as the ballot closed. This year, there was a lot of litigation in advance. For example, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court extended deadlines for the receipt of absentee ballots. And the U.S. Supreme Court deadlocked on whether that ruling was valid. That's when they had 8 justices. Now they have 9. So even though you shift from this pre-ballot litigation to the post-ballot litigation, I fear my colleague who just spoke might be right. I don't know how far we are from 2020. Indeed, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, one of the new members of the court, favorably cited Bush v. Gore and Chief Justice Rehnquist's opinion, suggesting that even the Bush v. Gore precedent, which was very controversial, may have some fans on the U.S. Supreme Court.
Jeff Hauser?
I'm very worried about that. 3 of the justices were, in fact, on George W. Bush's legal team, which does very much suggest that they are willing and able to vote and move forward in a very partisan manner. And I mean, I don't really know what more the Democrats can do in terms of this current Supreme Court. I think that they had as a strategy in the Senate during the Amy Coney Barrett confirmation hearings the absence of a strategy. They had obviously well past her prime Senate Judiciary Committee ranking member, and they basically decided the election was going well enough. They didn't really need to oppose the Supreme Court nomination. And a lot of progressives in this country were very upset with Senate leadership's strategy of essentially acquiescing, of voting but not doing anything to suggest anything especially improper was occurring in the Senate with the rushed confirmation process of Coney Barrett. And I think the left was right, and the center of the Democratic Party has a lot to answer for.
Center of the Democratic Party strategy. These, by the looks of it, are going to become debates on all sorts of levels as this evening progresses. Jeff Hauser, thank you very much. Josh Blackman, thank you. Steve, thank you very much to you. Back to Adrian.